The lights of the studio blazed down with an intensity that made the air itself feel heavy. Every camera in the room was trained on the two men seated across from each other at the sleek round table. On one side sat Donald Trump, his face flushed, jaw set, and body leaning forward as though he were ready to lunge at any challenge hurled his way. Opposite him sat Denzel Washington, calm, deliberate, his bald head gleaming under the lights, his eyes sharp and unwavering. The contrast was electric, rage versus resolve, chaos against composure. Millions of viewers tuned into what was billed as just another political debate, but within minutes it became clear this was no ordinary exchange. The stakes were higher, the words sharper, and the tension so thick it was almost visible. The moderator barely managed to introduce the night's topic, America's future in a fractured world, before Trump bulldozed into his monologue, boasting about strength, dismissing critics, and taking jabs at anyone who dared question his vision. But Denzel didn't flinch. He sat in silence, letting Trump's storm of words crash into the silence of his stillness. When the cameras cut to him, his face told a different story, not of fear, not of hesitation, but of a man who knew exactly when to strike. And then, as Trump paused to take a breath, Denzel leaned in. His voice was steady, almost quiet, but it sliced through the studio louder than any shout could have. "You're a disgrace to America," he said. Gasps rippled through the live audience, and even the moderator froze. Trump's face twitched, his eyes widened in disbelief, and for a moment, just a flicker, the unshakable facade cracked. It wasn't just a statement, it was a detonator. The explosion was about to begin. The studio fell into a silence so sharp it could cut glass. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the lights above and the collective gasp of an audience realizing they had just witnessed history being made. Trump, visibly stunned, leaned back in his chair as though he needed space from Denzel's words, but quickly leaned forward again, his finger raised in that familiar accusatory gesture. His voice, usually booming with confidence, cracked as he shouted, "How dare you? I've done more for this country than anyone in history." But Denzel didn't blink. He leaned slightly closer, folding his hands calmly on the table, his composure only amplifying the fury spilling from Trump. "You confuse service with self-interest," Denzel replied, his words deliberate, unhurried. "You bend to power, and you trample the powerless. That's not leadership. That's disgrace." The crowd erupted, half in applause, half in outrage. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every twitch of Trump's face as he struggled to regain control. He slammed a hand against the table, rattling the microphones, and barked, "You're just an actor. This isn't Hollywood. This is the real world." Denzel's response was swift, delivered like a seasoned fighter who knew exactly where to land the blow. "And maybe that's the problem," he said, his eyes locked onto Trump's. "You've turned America into your stage. But the world isn't your audience, it's your responsibility. And right now, you're failing them." The moderator, visibly rattled, tried to intervene, but the clash had already taken on a life of its own. Millions watching from home leaned closer to their screens, some in shock, others cheering, all fully aware they were witnessing one of the rawest confrontations ever broadcast live. Trump's face reddened, his jaw tightening as he jabbed a finger across the table. "Failing? You don't know the first thing about leadership. I rebuilt this country while Hollywood elites like you sat in your mansions, criticizing real men who make real decisions." His words echoed with fury, but beneath the volume, there was a tremor, a sign that Denzel's calm precision was cutting deeper than any insult could. The audience shifted uneasily, the tension in the room like a coiled spring ready to snap. Some clapped at Trump's bravado, others booed, and yet all eyes remained glued to the man sitting opposite him. Denzel leaned back in his chair, hands folded neatly, his voice dropping lower, steadier, more dangerous than shouting could ever be. "Leadership isn't about flexing power," Denzel said, never breaking eye contact. "It's about earning trust. You rebuild walls, not bridges. You shout about victories, but ignore the wounded you leave behind. And the truth is, real men don't need to belittle others to prove their strength." Gasps rippled through the audience. The camera cut to Trump's clenched fists on the table, knuckles white, his mouth twisting as he searched for a comeback. Instead, what escaped was a guttural snarl, "You're a disgrace. You and every one of your Hollywood friends who hate America." Before he could finish, Denzel raised a hand, silencing him with nothing more than the weight of his presence. "No," he interrupted firmly. "I love America enough to hold it accountable. You mistake criticism for hate because deep down, you can't face your own reflection." The studio seemed to stop breathing. The clash wasn't just two men trading words, it was an entire nation's struggle condensed into a single moment. The silence after Denzel's words was deafening, the kind that crushes the air out of a room. For a split second, even Trump seemed frozen, as if the weight of the truth had knocked the wind out of him. Then, almost on instinct, he leaned forward, palms slamming the table so hard the microphones rattled. "You think you can lecture me? You? You're an actor, Denzel. You memorize lines for a living. I built empires, I ran a nation. Don't you dare compare yourself to me." The outburst drew a mixture of gasps and scattered cheers from Trump loyalists in the audience. Yet the cheers were nervous, fragile, as if even they could feel the tide turning. The camera zoomed in on Denzel, who didn't flinch. Instead, he allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to creep across his face, the kind of smile that says, "You've already lost this battle." When he finally spoke, his tone was soft, but every word landed like a hammer. "You built empires on the backs of the powerless. You ran a nation like it was a business deal, profits first, people last. And the truth? America deserves better than a salesman who can't tell the difference between leadership and ego." The audience erupted, not in divided chaos this time, but in a thunderous applause that drowned out Trump's protests. Viewers at home lit up social media instantly, clips spreading like wildfire, hashtags exploding across platforms. Trump's face turned crimson, his voice breaking as he tried to shout over the noise, "Fake news. All lies. You're twisting everything." But his words were swallowed by the roar of the crowd. And there sat Denzel, steady, calm, eyes locked on Trump with the patience of a man who knew that sometimes the most devastating strike was simply refusing to back down. The moderator, clearly rattled, shuffled his notes and attempted to regain control, his voice cracking through the microphone, "Gentlemen, please, let's keep this civil." But the civility had already burned away, the stage had become a battleground. Trump, red-faced and visibly shaking, pointed a finger at Denzel as though trying to pin him against the wall with sheer force of will. "You don't represent America. You represent Hollywood elites, people who hate this country and want to destroy everything we've built." The accusation lingered for a moment, but Denzel leaned forward, his voice cutting through the noise like steel. "Hollywood didn't storm the Capitol. Hollywood didn't lock children in cages. Hollywood didn't tear apart families for headlines. You did that, Donald. And deep down, you know it. This isn't about Hollywood versus America, it's about you versus accountability." The word struck like lightning. The audience, already on edge, responded with a split second of silence before exploding into cheers so loud they drowned out Trump's attempts to interrupt. Online, the clip began trending immediately, the hashtags piling up, #Disgrace to America, #Denzel versus Trump, #LiveTV explosion. Trump tried again to cut through the noise, jabbing his finger toward the cameras. "This is a setup, a witch hunt. They've been after me since day one because they know I tell the truth. They're scared of me because I'm the only one who can save America." But the plea sounded desperate, rehearsed, hollow. And Denzel, without raising his voice, delivered the dagger. "America doesn't need saving from the truth. It needs saving from you." The audience erupted once more, a standing ovation this time, the roar echoing across the studio walls. The moderator buried his face in his notes, unable to control the tidal wave that had overtaken the debate. Trump slammed his hand on the desk, shouting incoherently, while Denzel sat calm, unmovable, his steady gaze a mirror reflecting Trump's unraveling. The energy inside the studio was no longer that of a political debate, it was an eruption, a cultural earthquake shaking the very foundation of what viewers expected. Camera operators scrambled to capture every angle as the audience swelled into chants that seemed almost rehearsed by fate. Denzel. 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 The name echoed like a drumbeat of defiance, while Trump's face twisted in fury, the spotlight suddenly feeling less like power and more like exposure. Trump leaned forward, gripping the edge of his podium so tightly his knuckles turned white. You think you're some kind of hero? You're nothing but a failed actor pretending to be relevant. People like you, weak, soft, fake, you've never built anything. I built towers, I built an empire, I built America's greatness back. His words tumbled out faster, more frantic, as if each sentence was a brick he was desperately trying to stack before the wall around him crumbled. Denzel didn't flinch. He simply tilted his head, eyes steady, voice sharp but calm. If building towers and chasing headlines is greatness, then we've all misunderstood what America means. Greatness isn't gold-plated signs on skyscrapers, it's integrity, it's courage, it's standing for people who don't have a voice. And Donald, when the weakest needed a hand, you gave them a boot. Gasps rippled through the audience. A woman in the front row covered her mouth. A man in the back shouted, "That's the truth." The moderator tried once more to intervene, but his voice drowned beneath the sheer electricity in the room. Trump, now pacing, shot back, "You're lying. You're lying like every left-wing puppet. You hate me because I'm strong, because I win, because I don't play by their rules. You're their tool, Denzel. Nothing more." And then, with perfect timing, Denzel delivered a line that would dominate headlines for weeks. Strong men don't crush the powerless to prove their strength. Only weak men do that. And weakness, Donald, where's your name? The explosion of applause, boos, and raw noise made the studio shake. Phones lit up across the nation as millions clipped, shared, and dissected the moment. It wasn't just a debate anymore, it was the unmasking of a man in real time, a live spectacle of pride colliding with principle. The moderator, clearly rattled, raised his hand in a futile attempt to regain control. His voice cracked as he muttered, "Gentlemen, let's please return to policy," but by then, policy had evaporated into smoke. This was no longer about healthcare plans or foreign policy talking points, it was about character, morality, and the raw clash of two worldviews colliding on live television. Trump's face flushed crimson as he jabbed his finger toward Denzel. You think you're some kind of moral compass? You sit there with your Hollywood applause, pretending to speak for the people. The truth is, you've never carried the weight I have. You don't know what it's like to have every country on earth look at you and know you're the strongest man alive. His voice thundered, but beneath the bravado, there was a tremor, a crack in the armor. Denzel leaned forward, his calmness cutting sharper than any shout. Strength isn't about fear, Donald. It's about responsibility. When you had the world's ear, you didn't inspire unity, you magnified division. And when America needed healing, you gave them rage. That's not strength. That's neglect dressed up as power. The studio audience erupted again, some clapping furiously, others jeering with raw anger. The air was thick with tension, as if even the cameras couldn't decide whose truth to frame. Trump's hands flailed as he barked back, "Fake. Fake news. You sound just like CNN. You don't get to lecture me, Denzel. You're an actor. I was the president. I held the nuclear codes, you held scripts." Denzel, unshaken, slowly stood from his chair. His shadow stretched across the stage as he delivered the line that seemed to hang in the air like a final verdict. "The difference is, Donald, my scripts were fiction. Yours were written on the lives of real people. And the tragedy is, you treated both the same." For a moment, the entire room fell silent. The audience stopped breathing, the cameras zoomed closer, and even Trump's mouth froze open. It was the kind of silence that speaks louder than thunder, the silence of recognition, the silence of a truth too sharp to dodge. And then, as if reality snapped back into place, the noise erupted again, cheers, boos, shouts, the chaos of a nation split right down the middle. Millions of viewers at home leaned closer to their screens, sensing they weren't just watching a debate. They were watching history unravel, live and unfiltered. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every bead of sweat on Trump's brow, every flicker of controlled fire in Denzel's eyes. The studio had transformed into a courtroom, and the jury was not 12 men and women, it was the entire nation, watching with unblinking eyes. Trump, unable to withstand the silence, slammed his fist against the desk. "I gave this country everything. Jobs, security, respect on the world stage. And what do I get? Lies, betrayals, and people like you, celebrity pretenders, trying to erase my legacy." His voice cracked mid-sentence, desperation bleeding through the rage. Denzel, unflinching, spoke softly, but the words carried like a hammer striking stone. "Respect isn't demanded, Donald. It's earned. And you didn't earn respect, you bartered it, sold it to the highest bidder, and left the American people to pick up the tab." The audience gasped, some clutching their phones, already live tweeting the exchange. Across social media, clips spread like wildfire. Denzel dismantles Trump, this is history in the making, the moment America held its breath. Trump lunged forward, gripping the edge of his podium, his voice rising into a roar. "You're nothing but a disgrace. You dare to stand there, lecturing me about America, when you've done nothing for this country." But Denzel's reply was like ice water over fire. "I didn't separate children from their parents. I didn't turn allies into enemies. I didn't pit neighbor against neighbor. If defending humanity is nothing, then maybe that's why America is drowning in the consequences of your everything." The room shook with applause. Some audience members stood, clapping furiously, while others shouted in outrage. The moderator, his hands trembling, leaned into his mic, "We need to move on," but everyone knew they couldn't move on. The debate was no longer following a script, it was an unchained confrontation that cut straight to the heart of America's identity. And in that moment, as Trump shouted over the crowd and Denzel stood unbothered, the contrast was undeniable, one man fueled by chaos, the other by clarity. The chaos inside the studio felt like an earthquake, shaking not just the stage but the very perception of those watching at home. Social media feeds exploded with split-screen images of Trump, red-faced and shouting, against Denzel, calm and unflinching. Memes were being born in real time, hashtags trending at lightning speed, hashtag disgrace to America, hashtag Denzel versus Trump, hashtag live TV explosion. Trump, sensing control slipping through his fingers, pointed a trembling finger at Denzel. "You think you represent the people? You think you're their voice? You're a fraud, Washington, just another puppet for the elite who hate me because I exposed them." His words came out like thunder, but the more he shouted, the more unsteady his footing appeared. Denzel leaned in slightly, his voice low yet amplified by the silence that followed Trump's tirade. "I don't represent the elites, Donald. I represent every family who lost hope while you built walls instead of bridges. I represent every worker who watched you give tax breaks to billionaires while they struggled to buy bread. I represent America, not the stage version you sold, but the real one you ignored." The crowd erupted, half in furious cheers, half in raw boos. Some audience members stood, shouting Trump's name in loyalty, while others pointed their phones toward Denzel as if documenting the birth of a revolution. The moderator's voice cracked as he tried to interject, but it was useless. The debate had morphed into a battle of raw wills, and no rulebook could restrain it now. Security shifted nervously, ready for the possibility that words could spill into something more. Then Denzel delivered the line that would dominate every headline the next morning, "Donald, you don't love America. You love power. And the problem is, America finally sees the difference." The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was electric, the kind of silence that precedes either thunderous applause or a collective reckoning. And when the sound came, it wasn't applause or boos. It was a roaring wave of both, a nation splitting itself down the middle in real time. The camera panned out, capturing the wide shot, Trump raging, Denzel steady, and a crowd torn between past and future. The final minutes of the broadcast felt like standing on the edge of history. The moderator, pale and exhausted, tried once more to bring order, but his words were drowned by the tidal wave of noise crashing through the studio. Half the crowd chanted Trump's name, clinging desperately to the past. The other half erupted in cheers for Denzel, their voices rising like a chorus of defiance. Trump, fists clenched, leaned into the camera as if to bypass Denzel and speak directly to the millions watching at home. They want to take your country away. They want to silence your voice and replace it with weakness. I am your voice, and I will never, ever surrender. His declaration rang out, but there was a tremor in his voice, a crack that betrayed desperation. Denzel didn't flinch. Instead, he slowly turned to face the camera as well, his tone measured, his words chosen with surgical precision. No, Donald. You are not their voice. You are their echo of fear. And fear has ruled long enough. America doesn't need a man who clings to power, it needs people who lift each other up. That's the real voice of this nation. The words landed like a verdict. The crowd erupted again, the split more visible than ever. But this time, it wasn't just noise, it was a decision forming, a collective realization spreading through living rooms across the country. The moderator, almost whispering, signaled the end of the debate. That concludes tonight's event, but the cameras stayed on, unwilling to miss a second. The wide shot showed it all, Trump storming off stage, his face twisted in rage, refusing to shake hands. Denzel standing tall, shoulders squared, receiving a standing ovation from half the room and a storm of boos from the other. In homes across America, people sat in stunned silence. Some reached for their phones, typing furiously about what they had just witnessed. Others simply stared at the screen, knowing they had seen something unforgettable, not just a debate, but a reckoning. And when the screen finally faded to black, one truth echoed louder than the shouting, louder than the applause, louder than the rage. This was the night Donald Trump's mask cracked, and Denzel Washington told America what it already feared to admit: its greatest disgrace had just been exposed on live TV. Tonight, you witnessed history unfold, not through scripted lines or political spin, but through raw truth. One man shouted, the other stood tall, and America saw the difference between power and principle. Whether you cheered or whether you booed, you were part of this moment, and moments like these remind us that the future of democracy is decided not in silence, but in confrontation. This isn't the end of the debate. It's only the beginning. Stay tuned, because the truth will always find its voice.